Hey everyone, welcome to CineTruth. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where the line between life and death is razor thin? Today we're about to share a true story that will give you chills and make you reflect on the incredible strength of human willpower. This is the story of October 13th, 1972, when the Stella Maris College Old Christians rugby team's plane crashed in the Andes Mountains. What was supposed to be a routine trip quickly turned into a nightmare. It's a tale where death knocked again and again, but courage, determination, and sheer willpower sent it away each time. The story begins by showing us the rugby players and their families who are enjoying the journey to Chile. The match ahead is extremely important for them. The flight crosses some of the tallest mountains in the world, and soon the weather starts to deteriorate. The passengers feel a series of jolts, and the pilot realizes the plane is no longer under his control. Suddenly, the plane crashes into a mountain and splits into two pieces. Those seated in the back begin to fall out one by one, with no chance of survival, as they are surrounded by nothing but snow. As the plane crashes, the remaining passengers experience a massive shock, leaving most of them severely injured. They are disoriented, unable to process what just happened. But a few of the less injured passengers managed to pull themselves together and start helping others. One of the pilots had already died, and the other was barely alive, desperately trying to call for help using the radio. Unfortunately, the radio's battery was dead, and shortly after, the second pilot also passed away. This brought the death toll to 6. The remaining survivors were in critical condition, but they had no choice but to wait until morning, believing that the government would surely come looking for them. They used whatever they could to survive the cold, including seat covers as makeshift blankets. But when night fell, the cold became unbearable. Some of the wounded screamed and cried in pain. The others tried to calm them down, eventually helping them sleep. When morning came, Antonio, the captain of the rugby team, went to one of the surviving crew members and asked for a flare gun to signal the rescue team when they arrived. Unfortunately, the crew member had no such gun and explained that the remaining radio batteries were in the tail of the plane, which had broken off long ago. However, Antonio managed to rig the radio just enough to listen to outside news. But they would still need those batteries to send out a signal. The group then carried the bodies of the deceased passengers outside and held an emotional farewell, mourning their lost friends and loved ones. Afterward, they began looking for food, but realized they didn't have much. They decided to ration what little they had, eating just enough to stay alive until the rescue team arrived. As they were discussing their situation, they suddenly heard the sound of a helicopter. But due to the bad weather, they couldn't see it, and the helicopter couldn't spot them either. And so, they were forced to endure yet another night in the freezing cold. And now, a quick word from our sponsor. If you're managing multiple accounts and need a reliable browser for the job, look no further than GoLogin. It's the best browser for multi-accounting, making your life simpler and more secure. Check it out and give it a try. Now, back to the story. The next day we are introduced to Nando, who had been unconscious since the plane crash, but now he finally regains consciousness. He is informed that his mother did not survive the crash. This news breaks Nando's heart, but Roberto quickly tells him that his sister is still alive and needs him desperately. Nando goes to his sister, comforting her, assuring her that everything will be okay. But the reality was far from that. No one was truly okay. The freezing cold was testing their mental strength, pushing them to their limits. Suddenly, they spot a plane in the distance. Overjoyed, they start dancing and cheering, believing rescue is finally near. The plane even seemed to turn in their direction, but to their shock, it flew away. Despite this disappointment, they were convinced that rescue would come the next morning. Filled with hope, they ate all the remaining chocolates they had. However, when morning came, no rescue team arrived. That's when they realized the plane hadn't seen them after all. Antonio opened the box to distribute food, only to find it empty. The night before, while he was asleep, the others had eaten everything. Antonio was furious and yelled at them, but it was too late to change anything. They now knew that if they wanted to survive, they had to find a way to send out a signal through the radio. But they still needed the batteries, which were in the tail section of the plane, and no one knew where it had fallen. With no other option, a group set out to find the batteries. But after covering some distance, they were stopped by an avalanche. They sat in place, defeated, realizing that getting out of this situation was far more difficult than they had imagined. They returned to the plane and spent yet another cold night in the wreckage. Friends, you can only imagine how difficult this time must have been for them. We can think about it, but to truly feel what they went through, those freezing, painful nights, is beyond our imagination. The following day, Antonio listened to the radio and heard the news that the government had officially called off the search for the survivors. The rescue operation was over. Antonio didn't want to share this with the others, fearing it would break their spirits. But somehow, the news spread, and everyone became deeply disheartened. Soon after, Nando's sister's condition worsened, and she tragically passed away. Nando, now having lost both his mother and sister, was completely devastated. By now, they had been stranded for 9 days. They could feel death slowly creeping closer as their food supply ran out. But Nando, determined to survive, gave the group a suggestion. If we want to make it out of here alive, we will have to eat the bodies of the dead. Otherwise, we will all starve to death. At first, everyone was horrified and rejected the idea, thinking it was madness. But with no other options left, one person finally said, "If I die in this cold, I give you all permission to eat my body." This sparked a nervous laughter among the group, but soon they all agreed they would allow each other to eat their bodies if they died, to save the rest. The next morning, unsure of what else to do, Roberto took the lead. He gathered the courage and began cutting into one of the dead bodies. It was one of the hardest decisions anyone could make, a horrifying act where humans had to eat other humans to survive. But there was no other choice. The others, seeing Roberto's courage, started doing the same, except for Nando. He stayed inside the plane crying, struggling with the fact that both his mother and sister's bodies were among the dead. Eventually, though, he too would have to accept this reality if he wanted to stay alive. After days of starvation, the group finally ate something and began to feel a little better, though the horror of what they had done weighed heavily on them. One night, while everyone was sleeping, a violent storm hit. The storm was so severe that it buried everyone under snow. When the storm finally passed, one by one, they struggled to dig themselves out, pulling out their buried companions as well. However, the storm was so powerful that 8 people didn't survive, including Antonio. Carlito, who had been waiting outside, told them, "God is with us, and for the first time in many days, the sun is out." They had now been stranded for 50 days. It was then that they made the decision to climb the mountain to find the tail section of the plane where the batteries were. They packed a little food and warm clothing, determined not to return until they had found what they needed. A small group set out on this difficult journey, and after walking for days, they finally reached the tail section. There, they found not only the batteries, but also some food and clothes, which filled them with joy. They tried to use the batteries to fix the radio, but despite their efforts, it didn't work. Disheartened, they had no choice but to return to their companions. By now, they had been stranded for 61 days, and Nando was determined to escape no matter what. He decided they needed to go even beyond the tail section, believing that there might be a way out. But Roberto wasn't convinced. He told Nando that it was too dangerous, and they didn't know if there was any path ahead. But Nando was resolute, and he began preparing sleeping bags from the remaining materials. With no other option, Roberto finally agreed, and they gathered some supplies. The 3-man team set off, telling the others to wait for them. Carlito came to see them off, sharing a dream he had about them reaching a lush green valley. This gave them some hope, and with goodbyes exchanged, they began their journey. No one knew what lay ahead, or if they would ever return. After 2 days of grueling travel, the 3 reached the mountain's summit. But when they looked beyond, they were shocked to see nothing but endless snow. There was no sign of rescue, just a blanket of white stretching as far as the eye could see. Roberto, defeated, lay down, believing they were doomed. He had lost all hope, convinced they couldn't survive any longer. But Nando refused to give up. He pointed out a distant ridge, saying, "I can see a small peak there. It's not visible now, but I believe there could be green valleys beyond it. Maybe God is testing us." Roberto tried to reason with him, saying, "Even if that's true, it's still 50 miles away. We'll die of exhaustion before we get there. We don't have the strength left." Still, Nando was determined to keep going. He convinced Roberto, and they sent their third companion back to the others to conserve food. Nando and Roberto continued on their journey, knowing that death was waiting for them with every step they took. After several more days of walking, they finally reached the green valleys, villages, and people in sight. It was a sight they could hardly believe after such a long struggle. Meanwhile, back at the crash site, the survivors had given up hope. Their food had run out, and they believed that Nando and Roberto had perished. They were preparing for their final moments, praying to God, when suddenly they heard a sound in the sky. Looking up, they couldn't believe their eyes. It was Nando and Roberto. They had returned with a rescue team. The joy among the survivors was indescribable. This story was narrated by Carlito, one of the survivors. He explained how, during this ordeal, he had felt a presence of a different kind of God, one they had been unaware of before. He said that 29 people lost their lives in the crash, and only 16 survived. Had Nando given up, they might never have made it out alive. It proved that when a person has the determination and the will to survive, they can overcome even the most impossible situations. In total, the survivors spent 72 days stranded in the mountains. The plane crashed on October 13, 1972, and they were rescued on December 20th, 1972. That's all for today. See you in the next video. Until then, thank you, take care, and goodbye.